All right, one last area we want to look at here is the area of peacemaking. And we can look at it at a microscopic level, if you will, with a dyad and all the way up to a national level. And we see a lot of examples of this happening around us, and some of the concepts that are embedded in this is equally as important. Essentially, in order to talk about peacemaking, then we have to talk about conflict itself. And essentially, conflict for our purposes here is defined as a perceived incompatibility of actions, goals, or ideas. Perceived, I see between you and I, and that's the key term here, is I see between you and I that we have goals, actions, and ideas that are incompatible with one another. That are incompatible. And so essentially all that flows out of conflict really rests on how we perceive things, how I see something. Perspective is everything in this case when we're talking about conflict. If I don't perceive you as having incompatible ideas and so forth, then I probably won't see you as problematic, or I won't have a conflict with you. Two key points to keep in mind, and this is not in your book, this is just for food for thought, is that most of the time when we look at conflict, the only way we look at it is in terms of destruction. Something goes wrong, something is destroyed. The interesting thing is that conflict is not necessarily the same as destruction. Actually, conflict can lead to a increase in intimacy between people, depending on how willing they are to engage in constructive conflict, which is entirely possible. But one of the key components to keep in mind here is that we have to be willing to operate by the same rules if we're going to actually have constructive conflict. So conflict in and of itself is not necessarily destructive. It can be constructive depending on this perception, which is really quite key when we're talking about this context. So one of the important concepts here is something that is referred to as a social trap. And a social trap are situations in which conflicting parties may become caught in mutually destructive behavior as they pursue their own ends, thus creating an outcome that no one wants. And that's what a social trap is. Essentially, when the two parties, and let's just put it in a marriage context, when the husband and wife become involved in a destructive behavior, and they're a little bit like the old nursery rhyme of the Calico Cat and the Gingham Dog, who basically get into a fight and end up eating one another, and neither one is around anymore. And that's not a nursery rhyme that you probably have ever heard of, but it existed at one point in time. So what happens is that person A and B are in mutual connection with one another, and somewhere along the way this breaks, and then the conflict begins to wind its way lower and lower and lower, and it gets more and more destructive as time goes along, because as one perceives the other as an enemy, then the other behaves and mirrors that perception as well, which is something that we refer to as a mirror image perception. at least part of what keeps a conflict going is when one or both parties essentially see the other as evil. And so they paint themselves as moral and the other person as intentioned evil and unworthy of their respect and so forth. And so the key concept of these social traps is the ever degrading behavior that continues in that. Perceptions are everything. And so if a husband says, my wife is unfaithful, she will never be, I will never, let me put it this way, I will never trust her. Let's just say that the wife had an affair. Then all of her behavior will always be put in this context. The same way with the wife will say, my husband is unforgiving. And so all of his behavior is placed in that same context as well. And these mirror image perceptions keep nations, keep people at odds with one another, and the chances of actually getting over that or getting through that is very slim. Now, there are key components. If we were to promote peace, a number of let me get that right, promote peace. It's a number of C's that come into play. I have to have some measure of contact with the person. It may be just a simple conversation. What's interesting, if you follow the NHL, the National Hockey League, you'll see that they continue to have contact. They may not be getting anywhere, but they maintain some measure of contact between each other, and this seems to loosen up some of these mirror image perceptions that get in the way. A second component part is cooperation. When people are at odds with one another, and then they bond together against a common adversary, what you find is that a lot of the things that separated them suddenly go away because they have come together in a cooperative bond to overcome this particular adversary. There has to be some level of communication. Somewhere along the way, sometimes an intermediary comes in handy, a negotiator or so forth. And then finally, the last component part of that is conciliation, where the two people and two parties begin to consider at least a reconciliation between them, or at least engage in some measure of conciliatory behavior. The one thing that's mentioned here that's interesting kind of strategy is grit strategy, which essentially just stands for graduated and reciprocated initiatives and tension reduction. And some of this hinges on a willingness to cooperate in a sense, and a willingness to consider that these mirror image perceptions are not true. But we live in a very real world. We don't live in an ideal one, and we live in a world where there are parties and people who simply will not, because it's tied into even their religious perspectives, they will not release these perceptions of other people. The Muslims have a specific perspective about other people of faith, even, and we do too. We have those of Muslims, and it may not be nearly as awful. And for most Muslims, that's not true. They don't see us as all abusers either. The problem is if it is inequitable, if one person is willing to let go of those perceptions and the other party is not, then conciliation is really halted my ability to actually reconcile with somebody is completely brought to a standstill when they refuse to consider me in some other light other than the negative light that they may be hanging on to. So just a few observations, key concepts when it comes to peacemaking, the whole idea of promoting peace with the 4 C's: contact, cooperation, communication, and conciliation, the mirror image perceptions between people, and how conflict actually can be overcome depending on what happens and what we do with these perceptions.